The glass of sparkling water trembled in my hand as I stood up from that banquet table in front of 240 people. Every face in that ballroom turned toward me. Some were confused. Some were already reaching for their phones. And the man at the podium, the man who had just finished his toast calling himself my son's greatest mentor, his second father, the backbone of everything my son had built, that man went completely still when our eyes met across the room. Because he recognized me. After 31 years, he recognized me. And he knew in that moment that I had not come to celebrate. I need to take you back to the beginning. Not to that night at the Fairmont in downtown Toronto, not to the applause and the crystal chandeliers and the smell of garlic butter from the kitchen. I need to take you back to a Thursday morning in November, 1993, when a foreman knocked on my door at 6:45 in the morning and told me there had been an accident at the site. My husband had been working construction for 11 years at that point. We had moved from Sudbury to the Barrie area 3 years before because a development company called Crestfield Properties was building an entire subdivision north of the city, and they needed experienced crews. The pay was better than anything we had seen in northern Ontario. My husband came home every Friday with mud on his boots and a smile on his face, and I had just gone back to work part-time at the hospital after our son's birth. We were not rich. We were not even close. But we were building something. That was the word we always used, building. The foreman's name does not matter now. What matters is what he told me standing in my doorway while my 8-month-old son slept in his crib down the hall. There had been a scaffolding collapse, 3rd floor. My husband had fallen. They had taken him to Royal Victoria by ambulance, but the injuries were severe and I needed to come right away. I left my son with our neighbor and I drove to that hospital, and I sat in a waiting room for 4 hours, and then a doctor came and sat across from me and said the words that broke every version of the future I had imagined. My husband was gone. He was 34 years old. He had never held our son long enough to feel how heavy he was getting. What followed was the kind of grief that does not announce itself all at once. It comes in waves for months, then years. I was 29 years old, alone in a house I could barely afford, with an infant and a part-time nursing job and a casserole on my doorstep every second day from the women at our church. I was grateful for every single one of those casseroles. I was grateful, and I was terrified, and I was so angry at the world that some mornings I had to sit in my car in the hospital parking lot for 10 minutes before I could put my face together and walk inside. The Workers' Compensation Board processed my claim. I received survivor benefits. It was not enough to grieve on, but it was enough to survive on, and I learned quickly that those two things were very different. I picked up extra shifts. I studied for my RN through correspondence. I moved us into a smaller place in Innisfil where the rent was lower and the school was decent, and there was a park close enough that my son could walk to it when he was older. I raised him in that house for 19 years. Just the two of us. He was a quiet boy who became a serious young man. He loved hockey in the way that every boy in Ontario loves hockey, with his whole body and no reservations. He was good at math in that practical way where he could look at a problem and find the shortcut before he even knew why it worked. By the time he was in high school, he was already talking about real estate, about development, about building things. I used to listen to him at the kitchen table, going on about square footage and zoning bylaws, and I would feel something complicated move through me. Pride first. Always pride. But underneath it, something quieter. Something I never named out loud. He went to Ryerson for urban planning. He worked summers for a property management company in Barrie. By the time he was 28, he had his own small development firm. Nothing dramatic. Residential renovations mostly. Infill projects, then a partnership, then something larger. His partner was a man named Gerald. I had met Gerald twice at that point. Once at my son's office when I dropped off a birthday cake, and once at a dinner where Gerald had been charming and expansive and had ordered the most expensive wine on the menu and picked up the bill with the kind of ease that made me feel like I was supposed to be impressed. I was polite. I was always polite. But there was something about Gerald that sat wrong with me in a way I could not put into words, and so I did not try. My son and Gerald were being honored at a real estate industry gala, the Greater Toronto and Hamilton Area Development Excellence Awards. My son had called me 2 months before the event, voice full of the specific excitement he had always been careful to understate, and told me the firm had won a major award for sustainable residential development. He wanted me there. He had already arranged the ticket and the hotel room and a car service to take me from Barrie to Toronto without my having to drive. I said of course I would come. I ironed the navy dress I had bought for my retirement dinner. I had my hair done at the salon on the main street where Irene, who had been cutting my hair for 12 years, told me I looked like someone's favorite grandmother. I told her I was someone's favorite grandmother, technically, though my son was not yet married and that status was entirely honorary. She laughed. I laughed. I drove to Barrie GO station in good spirits. The ballroom was everything you would expect from an event like that. Round tables with white cloths and small arrangements of white roses, name placards in gold font, an open bar that I approached once for a glass of sparkling water because I was driving back to the hotel after, and I have never been someone who drinks when I have somewhere to be. I found my table. I was seated with other guests of award recipients, a kind woman from Mississauga who was someone's aunt, a retired engineer who talked about tensile strength until the first course arrived. I smiled at everyone. I was proud. I was genuinely, uncomplicated, entirely proud of my son. The ceremony began. Awards were presented in categories. My son's firm won in the 3rd category, and he went up to the stage and gave a short, gracious speech and thanked his team, and then he said something that made me set down my fork. He said he wanted to thank the man who had believed in him before anyone else did. He said this man had been a guiding force, a mentor, someone who understood the industry from the ground up in ways that very few people did. He gestured toward the table near the stage and said Gerald's name. Gerald stood and accepted the acknowledgement, and the room applauded. And I looked at Gerald. I looked at him the way you look, at something that has been in your peripheral vision for a long time, something you have been not quite letting yourself see. I looked at the particular way he held his shoulders, the shape of his jaw, the silver hair that had once been dark brown. I was certain of that, dark brown combed back from a wide forehead. And I felt the floor shift underneath me. I knew that face. Not from my son's office, not from the dinner with the expensive wine. I knew that face from 31 years ago, from a government document I had read in a lawyer's office 18 months after my husband died, when I was trying to understand why the workers' compensation investigation had been closed so quickly, why no individual had been named in the site safety violation, why the incident report had concluded with the phrase systemic oversight rather than identifying who had signed off on the scaffolding inspection that week. The site supervisor on duty the day my husband died had been a man in his early 30s. His name had been listed once in a supplementary document the lawyer had obtained through a Freedom of Information request, and then crossed out, and then a WCB representative had told us the document had been misfiled and was not relevant to our claim, and the name had simply disappeared from the official record. I had written that name down in a small notebook that I still kept in the top drawer of my bedside table. That name was Gerald. I want to be precise about what happened inside me in that moment, sitting at a banquet table in a Toronto ballroom, because it was not the hot surge of anger you might imagine. It was colder than that. It was the feeling of a very long question finally finding its answer. 31 years of a question. And underneath it, moving up slowly like groundwater, something that felt almost like relief. Not peace, not yet, but the particular relief of being right about something you were told you had imagined. I had not imagined it. I sat through the rest of the ceremony. I ate my salmon. I drank my sparkling water. I watched Gerald work the room between courses, touching shoulders, laughing with his head back, the practiced ease of a man who had spent decades being comfortable in rooms like this one. A man who had built a career in the same industry, where my husband had died because of his negligence. A man who had apparently never been held accountable for a single day of it. And then I thought about my son who had grown up without a father, who had learned to tie a tie from a YouTube video at 17 because I did not know how, who had cried exactly once in front of me about it when he was 12 after a father-son hockey tournament at the arena, and who had never mentioned it again because he was trying to protect me from knowing how much it hurt him. My son, who had somehow, without knowing it, built his career alongside the man responsible for his father's death. I thought, does he know? And then I thought, he cannot know. He cannot possibly know. I went back to my hotel room that night, and I sat on the edge of the bed, and I opened my laptop, and I began to search. I was not sure what I would find after 30 years. But I am a retired nurse, and nurses are methodical people. We document, we follow the thread. I found a digitized archive from a Barrie newspaper, a brief article from 1994 about a workers' compensation appeal filed by the family of a construction worker. The appeal had been denied. The company named in the original complaint, Crestfield Properties, had been dissolved and reformed under a new name by 1996. A man named Gerald Whitmore had been listed as a junior site manager at Crestfield in a separate business registry document from 1992. Gerald Whitmore. The same Gerald whose last name I had seen on my son's company registration papers, which I had read carefully and filed away when my son had shown them to me 3 years ago, because that is the kind of mother I am. I did not sleep that night. I sat at the desk by the window with the lights of the city below me, and I thought about what to do. I thought about calling my son right then. I thought about walking up to Gerald in the hotel lobby. I thought about a lot of things. What I decided, in the end, was that I needed to be sure. Not almost sure, not probably sure, completely sure. Because if I was going to say what I intended to say, I needed it to be unassailable. I needed every word to be documented. Every claim to have a source I could hold in my hands. I am 63 years old. I have been patient before. I could be patient again. Over the next 4 months, I did things I had never done in my life. I contacted a retired journalist in Barrie who had covered the original incident for the Northern Life newspaper in 1993 and who still had notes from that period. I filed a Freedom of Information request with the Ontario Ministry of Labour for the original inspection records from the Crestfield site. I found a retired WCB officer through a Public Employees Association who confirmed, off the record, that there had been significant irregularities in how that case had been handled and that records had been incomplete when the file was passed between reviewers. And one Tuesday morning in March, I received a package in the mail from the Ministry of Labour. Inside was a partially redacted copy of the original site inspection report from the week of my husband's death, stamped with a request number and an official seal. The scaffolding on the 3rd floor had failed a preliminary check the week before the collapse. The corrective action required had been signed off as completed by the supervising foreman on site. The signature on that sign-off was not legible, but the printed name below it was. I sat at my kitchen table in Innisfil, and I held that piece of paper and I said my husband's name out loud for the first time in a very long time. I called my son that afternoon. I told him I needed to come to Toronto and that it was important. He said, "Of course, come for dinner. Was everything all right?" I said everything was fine. I just had some things I wanted to talk through with him. He did not push. He has never pushed. That is one of the ways he is exactly like his father. I drove to his condo on a Friday evening. He made pasta, the only thing he can reliably cook, and we sat at his kitchen island and I told him everything. I started at the beginning. I told him about the scaffolding, about the WCB claim, about the name in the notebook in my bedside table. I told him about the night at the ballroom. I watched his face as I spoke. He was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then he told me something that I was not prepared for. He told me he had known Gerald's connection to Crestfield Properties for 8 months. He had found the information by accident while doing a title search on a property, had seen the corporate chain of names, had recognized Crestfield from the documents I had shown him years before. He had not told me because he was trying to figure out what to do. He was afraid of what it would mean for the partnership, for the business they had built. He was afraid of what it would do to me. He said he was going to handle it. He said he was waiting for the right moment. I understood, in that moment, why my son had kept this from me. I understood the weight he had been carrying, the impossible position of loving two things that had turned out to be in direct opposition to each other. I understood all of it. And I also felt something break very quietly somewhere in my chest. Not because he had wronged me, but because he had carried that alone, the way I had carried so many things alone, and we had each been trying to protect the other, and in the end we had both just been sitting with a secret in separate rooms of the same grief. I told him I was not angry. I meant it. I told him I needed him to trust me. I told him I knew what I wanted to do, and I needed him to let me do it. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded. The annual industry dinner where Gerald's firm was presenting a keynote on development ethics. I want you to sit with that particular irony for just a moment was scheduled for 6 weeks later. My son had been invited. Gerald would be speaking. My son added me as his guest. I wore the navy dress again. I sat at the table assigned to my son's firm, near the front of the room, in the seat that had been arranged for me. I was not at a side table. I was not tucked away. I was at the third table from the stage, and when Gerald walked past on his way to the podium, he looked at me with the polite, blank expression of a man who half recognizes a face but cannot place it, and then he moved on. He gave his keynote. He talked about responsible development. He talked about the obligation to the communities where builders work, the trust placed in people who shape the physical spaces where families live. He talked about legacy. He used that word twice. Legacy. When he finished and the applause began to settle and people reached for their wine glasses and the room filled again with that gentle roar of 200 people resuming their conversations, I stood up. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. There is a particular quality of silence that forms when a woman of a certain age stands up at a formal dinner and does not sit back down, and that silence had already begun to spread from my table outward before I said a single word. I said, I am sorry to interrupt the evening, but I have something that belongs to this conversation about legacy, and I think it should be said here. Gerald turned from where he was still standing, near the podium. He looked at me, and I watched his face. I watched it very carefully, and I saw the moment it happened, the moment of recognition, the moment the polite blank expression cracked, and underneath it was something else entirely. I said, my husband worked on one of your sites in 1993. He was 34 years old, and he had an 8-month-old son at home, and he died because the scaffolding on the 3rd floor had failed its inspection, and the person responsible for signing off on the corrective work signed off anyway. His name is on a Ministry of Labor document that I received through a Freedom of Information request. That document is currently with my solicitor in Barrie, along with testimony I have gathered from a journalist and a former WCB officer about the irregularities in how that case was handled. I paused. The room was completely still. I said, I am not here to make a scene. I am here because my son, who built his career in the same industry that took his father, deserves to know who he has been working beside. And because the families of the other 2 men who were injured on that site in 1993 deserve to know that someone remembers. I sat down. I wish I could tell you there was a dramatic moment. A confrontation, a raised voice, a security guard. There was none of that. There was a long, dense quiet, the kind that comes when 200 people process something at the same time. There was the sound of a chair scraping. There was a woman at Gerald's table who put her hand on the arm of the man beside her. There was a photographer from the industry publication who had been circling the room all evening and who was now completely still near the back wall. Gerald did not speak. He set down his microphone on the podium. He walked toward the exit doors at the side of the ballroom, and he went through them, and the doors swung shut behind him. My son put his hand over mine on the table. He did not say anything. He did not need to. In the weeks that followed, the Ministry of Labor announced it was reviewing the file. The Industry Association released a statement about their commitment to accountability in response to concerns raised at the dinner. 2 journalists contacted my solicitor. The firm that Gerald and my son had built together went through a very difficult restructuring. My son lost some things. He gained clarity, and I think, in the end, that was worth more. I drove back to Innisfil on a Thursday evening in late spring with the window down a little, the air cool and smelling of the lake the way it does in May. I thought about the drive I had made in the other direction 11 years ago when I packed up the house where I had raised my son and moved for the last time. I thought about how many times I had made that highway stretch between Barrie and the city, for work, for my son, for appointments and graduations and dinners that mattered. How many hours I had spent on that road, carrying things I could not put down. I pulled into my driveway, and I turned off the engine, and I sat for a moment before going inside. There is a photograph on my mantelpiece. My husband at 26, standing on the frame of a house that is nothing yet, just wood and air and possibility, squinting into the sun with his hard hat pushed back on his head. I took that photograph. I know exactly where we were standing. I know the sound of the site around us, the smell of sawdust, and the particular cold of a September afternoon in Ontario. He was so proud of what he built. My son calls me every Sunday. He has started asking me questions about his father, real questions, the kind he was always afraid to ask before. What did he like to eat? What music did he have on in the car? What made him laugh? I answer all of them. I have been answering them for weeks now, and I am not even close to running out of answers, because I have had 31 years to remember every detail of the man I loved, and I have been saving all of it, without quite knowing I was doing it, for exactly this. Some things take a very long time to be finished, not because you are not ready, but because the moment is not yet ready for you. I learned that. I believe it. And I believe that when the moment finally comes, if you have been patient and careful, and you have done the work of making sure you are certain, not almost certain, not probably certain, but completely certain, then you will know what to say. And you will not need to raise your voice to say it. The first thing I heard was the fluorescent hum of the lights above me. Not voices, not footsteps, just that low electric buzz, and the beeping of a machine that was keeping count of my heartbeats in a way I apparently couldn't do myself anymore. The ceiling was white, textured, the kind you only really notice when you've got nothing else to look at. I stared at it for a long time before I understood where I was. Sunnybrook, the cardiac unit, Toronto. The second thing I noticed was that my son wasn't there. I'm 64 years old. I've lived in this country my whole life, born in Sudbury, raised in Thunder Bay, moved to Toronto when I was 22 with $40 and a suitcase that wouldn't close properly. I worked 40 years as a medical records coordinator at a hospital not unlike this one. I know what it looks like when a family comes together around a bed. I know the sounds, the hushed voices, the rustle of a coat being draped over a chair, the specific kind of quiet that means someone loves you and is scared to lose you. My room was just the machine and the lights. My name is Vera. No, wait. I need to correct myself because for a long time I introduced myself the way my late husband introduced me, as Vera, Colin's mother. As Vera, who made the best butter tarts west of Kingston. As Vera, who volunteered at St. Laund, Agatha's every second Sunday and knew every hymn by heart without looking at the book. I'd spent 64 years being somebody's something. Lying in that hospital bed alone, I started wondering who I actually was on my own. But it had been a Tuesday in February. I remember because I'd made a grocery list that morning and it was still on the kitchen counter, held down by a coffee mug. Eggs. Milk, the good bread from the bakery on Danforth, sour cream for the pierogies I was planning to make for my grandson's birthday that weekend. My grandson, Finn, he was turning 6. He'd asked me for a dinosaur cake. I'd already bought the little plastic stegosauruses to put on top. I was at St. Agatha's for the Tuesday morning prayer group. It's a small group, mostly women in their 60s and 70s, a few widowers, a couple who'd been coming since before I was born. We meet in the fellowship hall, not the sanctuary. Folding tables, drip coffee, banana bread if Helen brought some. It's the kind of gathering that doesn't look like much from the outside, but has held me together through more than I can name. I'd stood up from the table to refill my coffee. That's the last thing I remember clearly, reaching for the carafe, the warmth of the handle, the smell of the coffee. Then I was on the floor, and then I was somewhere else entirely. Later, the doctor would tell me it was a cardiac event, not a full heart attack, but serious. Serious enough that the two women closest to me, Ruth and a newer member named Sylvette, called 911 immediately. Serious enough that the paramedics were there in under 8 minutes. Serious enough that I was in surgery within the hour. Serious enough that the hospital called my son 31 times before anyone answered. 31 times. I didn't know that number for several days. It was Sylvette who told me, quietly, sitting beside my bed on the third day, holding a Tim Hortons cup like it was something to do with her hands. She'd stayed. She'd come back every day. I'd known her for 4 months. My son had known me for 38 years. But his name is Colin. He's 38, works in commercial real estate, lives in Oakville with his wife Danny and their son Finn, my grandson, the one with the dinosaur cake. Colin is, by any visible measure, successful. He drives a nice car. His house has a finished basement and a backyard with a gas fire pit. He and Danny take 2 trips a year, usually somewhere warm in February and somewhere in Europe in the summer. He calls me on my birthday and at Christmas, and sometimes on random Sundays when he's in a good mood and wants to tell me about a deal he closed or a restaurant they tried. I used to brag about him. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I'd tell people at prayer group, at the pharmacy, at the neighbors' backyard parties. My son, the commercial real estate agent in Oakville, did very well for himself. I said it like I'd had something to do with it. Maybe I had. I'd worked double shifts for years to put him through university. I co-signed his first mortgage when the bank wouldn't approve him a loan. I'd looked after Finn every Monday for 3 years when childcare fell through, driving from Toronto to Oakville and back, making my knees ache for days after. I said all of that to myself, not to him. But that? On the 3rd day, when Sylvette told me about the 31 calls, I didn't say anything for a moment. I was still on oxygen. My chest felt like someone had left a boot on it. Did anyone reach him? I finally asked. She hesitated. Eventually. When? She looked at her coffee cup. The morning of the 2nd day. I closed my eyes. He'd known for over a day. He still wasn't here. Sylvette said very carefully, I think he and Danny were away. Not a question, a statement, offered gently, the way you offer an excuse for someone when you can see the person it belongs to won't be offering it themselves. I nodded. Okay, they were away. But that? He arrived in the afternoon of the 4th day. I heard him before I saw him. His voice in the hallway, that familiar, slightly too loud confidence, the same tone he used when he was explaining something to someone he considered beneath him. He was asking the nurse where my room was, like she'd specifically put it in an inconvenient location. He came in with Danny behind him. She was holding a small arrangement of flowers from what I recognized as the hospital gift shop, the plastic wrapping still on. She looked uncomfortable. She always looks a little uncomfortable around me, though I've never been able to figure out exactly why. Colin looked fine. He looked well-rested and slightly tanned, which at first I thought was the light, and then I thought maybe it wasn't. He hugged me carefully, the way you hug someone in a hospital bed when you're not sure what you're allowed to touch. He said, Mom, how are you feeling? You scared us. I noticed the us. I noticed the present tense, like the fear had been ongoing, like it had been accompanying him somewhere. I said I was feeling better. I thanked him for coming. He sat down. He told me about the drive from Oakville, traffic on the 401, some construction near the 427 exchange. He told me the doctor he'd spoken to in the hallway seemed very competent. He asked me what I needed, what he could bring, whether I had everything. I said I had everything I needed. Danny added the flowers to the windowsill, between Sylvette's card and a potted plant that Ruth had brought 2 days earlier. We talked for about 40 minutes. Then Colin said he had a showing at 4 and he'd need to head back. He'd call me tonight. He'd come again on the weekend, once I was home and more comfortable. He kissed my forehead. He squeezed my hand. He left. I looked at the ceiling again. But that? A few days later, when I was home and moving slowly through my apartment with instructions not to lift anything heavier than a kettle for the next 6 weeks, I got a phone call from my neighbor's daughter, a young woman named Petra Spenson, who'd grown up 2 floors below me and still checks in sometimes when she's in the building visiting her mother. Petra was cheerful, warm, asked how I was, told me she'd heard from her mother what happened, and wanted to see if I needed anything. I told her I was fine. We chatted. And then, in the way that things sometimes come out sideways in conversations you're not bracing for, she said, "Your son was on a trip, right? My mom said she saw some photos online. Looks like they had a nice time." I didn't say anything for a second. "What kind of trip?" I asked. She paused, sensing something. "I think a cottage? Or a ski lodge, maybe. Somewhere up north. There were photos of the kids in the snow. Looks like a bunch of families went together. The kids. Finn was there, my grandson who was turning 6 that Saturday, for whose birthday I had bought plastic stegosauruses and planned a cake from scratch, was on a trip with his parents while his grandmother was in cardiac surgery. "Oh," I said, "that's nice." I said it the way you say things when you're deciding in real time not to cry. But that? I need to tell you something about money because eventually it matters and I don't want it to seem like it came from nowhere. 3 years ago, I sold my house. The house I'd lived in for 27 years, the one in Scarborough, the one with the garden out back where I grew tomatoes every summer and where Colin had his 6th birthday party. I sold it because the maintenance was too much for me alone after my husband passed, and because the market was extraordinary, and because the financial advisor I'd been working with for a decade told me very clearly that the smart thing was to sell, invest the proceeds carefully, and rent somewhere smaller. The house sold for considerably more than I paid for it. After fees and taxes and the small mortgage I still had, I cleared $215,000. Colin knew about the sale. He helped me arrange the movers. He was cheerful about it in the way that people are cheerful about things that don't affect them directly. He never asked me what I planned to do with the money. Not once. I found that interesting. Either he assumed he knew, or he was being careful not to seem like he was asking. But that? I did not tell Colin what I did with the money. I put most of it into a combination of GICs and a moderate risk investment account on the advice of my financial advisor. I kept a portion accessible in a high-interest savings account. I made a new will with a lawyer I found on my own, not the one Colin had recommended 2 years earlier, who turned out to be his squash partner. I named Finn as a beneficiary, held in trust. I left a meaningful amount to St. Agatha's. I left something for Sylvette, though she doesn't know that yet, and probably won't for a long time. I did not leave anything to Colin and Danny. This was not a decision I made in anger. I want to be clear about that. I made it 3 months before I ever collapsed at that prayer group table. I made it after a long conversation with myself, and a longer one with my pastor, and a quiet afternoon at a coffee shop near my apartment where I sat with a notepad and wrote down in 2 columns the things Colin had done and the things I had told myself Colin had done. The second column was longer, by a lot. But that? Here is something I didn't expect. The phone call came not from Colin, but from Danny. It was about 6 weeks after I came home from the hospital. I was doing well, going to cardiac rehab on Tuesdays and Thursdays, walking to the grocery store, making soup, living my life. Danny called on a Wednesday evening, which was unusual. She normally lets Colin make the calls, or doesn't call at all. Her voice was bright in a particular way that I recognized, the brightness of someone who has rehearsed. She asked how I was. I said I was well. She said she was glad. She said Colin had been meaning to call, but had been so busy with a major commercial listing, she hoped I understood. I said, of course. She said, and I remember the exact shift in her tone here, that she and Colin had been thinking about doing some renovations on the house, the basement, specifically, turning it into a proper suite. For Finn, eventually, when he's older. But also, she said, laughing, a small rehearsed laugh, they'd always thought it would be nice to have a space where family could stay more permanently, if that was ever something that made sense. I let the silence sit for a moment. That sounds like a big project, I said. It is, she said. It would be a significant investment. She paused. We were wondering if you'd given any thought to what you were doing with the money from the house sale. There it was. I said pleasantly, oh, I've sorted all of that out, yes. It's been taken care of. Another pause, longer. Oh, what do you mean taken care of? I mean it's been invested and organized. I worked with my financial advisor and got my affairs in order after everything that happened. It seemed like the right time. I kept my voice warm and even. It was actually a very good exercise. I feel much more settled about everything now. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, right, of course. That's good, Mom. Mom? She calls me that sometimes, mostly when she wants something. We talked for another few minutes about nothing, and then she said goodbye, and I hung up and sat in my armchair and looked out at the street below for a long time. But that? Colin called 2 days later. He called in the evening, around 8, which was unusual. He opened with how I was feeling, which I answered, and then moved quickly into how things were at work, which I listened to, and then arrived with what I now recognized as the practiced casualness of a man who had rehearsed this too, at the topic of the house sale. He said he'd been thinking about it and wanted to make sure I had good advice. He knew a financial guy, not the squash partner, a different one, who was very good, someone he trusted completely, who could look at what I'd done and make sure I hadn't been steered wrong. I told him I was very happy with my current advisor and had been for years. He said he understood, but it would be good to get a second opinion on something this significant, wouldn't it? I said I didn't feel the need, but I appreciated his concern. He said, careful now, that he just wanted to make sure I was protected. That sometimes people in my situation, and he didn't say it, but I heard it in the gap, people my age, people who just had a health scare, could be vulnerable to not making the best decisions. People in my situation. I thought about that ceiling in the cardiac unit, the electric hum, the 31 unanswered calls. I said, Colin, I'm 64, not 104. I've been managing my own finances since before you were born. He backed off, laughed, said, of course, he just worried about me. Wasn't that allowed? I said, of course it was. We said goodbye. I put the phone down. I didn't cry. I'd been done crying about this for a while, I realized. The grief had already happened, somewhere in the hospital, somewhere between the beeping and the ceiling and the empty chair. I just hadn't given it a name yet. But that? Sylvette came for tea that Saturday. She's originally from Montreal, French-Canadian, speaks with an accent that gets stronger when she's telling a funny story, which she does often. She's 61, retired from teaching, recently divorced after 26 years. She joined the prayer group because, she told me once, she needed somewhere quiet to sit that wasn't her own apartment. We've become, without either of us planning it, genuinely close. She brought me soup when I came home from the hospital. She drove me to my first 3 cardiac rehab appointments. She calls to check in, not to catch up on gossip, not to give advice I didn't ask for, but just to ask, how did today go? I told her about Danny's call, and Colin's. She listened without interrupting, which is a skill more people should have. When I finished, she said, "What are you going to do?" I said I wasn't going to do anything dramatic. I wasn't going to write letters or make proclamations or show up in Oakville with a list of grievances. I was 64 years old and I had a functioning heart and a good financial situation and a church I loved and a friend who brought Earl Grey and didn't require anything of me. I'm going to live my life, I said. I'm going to spend my money on things I actually want. I'm going to see Finn carefully on my own terms because he's 6 and he didn't do anything wrong, and I'm going to stop waiting for an apology that isn't coming. Sylvette nodded slowly. She poured more tea. And the will? She asked. Done, I said, 3 months ago. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, in that accent that gets stronger when she means something, good. But that? Finn's birthday party was held at a soft play center in Oakville. Colin invited me, and I went, because Finn had asked me specifically and because I had a bag full of dinosaur toys and a chocolate cake that I'd made from scratch and carried on the GO train in a box on my lap. The party was busy and loud and beautiful in the way that 6-year-old birthday parties are. Children running and shrieking, juice boxes everywhere, the slightly glazed look of every adult present. Finn saw me come in and ran straight across the room and wrapped his arms around my legs. "Grandma, did you bring the dinosaurs?" I said I had. He grabbed my hand and pulled me through the crowd to show me the phone climbing structure, the ball pit, the corner where his friends were already arguing about who got to be the T-Rex. I stayed for 3 hours. I ate the pizza. I sang happy birthday in a room full of people who had no idea that 6 weeks earlier I'd been lying alone in a hospital bed while his parents sent 31 phone calls to voicemail. Danny was polite to me. Colin carried my bag to the car when I was leaving, and when he hugged me goodbye, he held on for a second longer than usual. I don't know what that meant. I didn't ask. On the GO train home, with the empty cake box on the seat beside me and the noise of the party still faintly in my ears, I looked out at the dark fields going past the window, and I thought about all the years I'd defined myself by my relationship to other people. Colin's mother, my husband's wife, the woman from St. Agatha's, the one who brought the butter tarts. I thought about the notepad on the coffee shop table, the 2 columns, the longer one. I thought about Sylvette asking simply, "How did today go?" I thought about Finn's arms around my legs, the weight of him. But I want to say something clearly, because I've told pieces of this story to a few people, and they always want it to end a certain way. They want the dramatic confrontation, the tearful apology, the son who comes to his senses and shows up, finally, properly, in the way I needed him to show up in that hospital room. I don't have that ending. I'm not sure I want it anymore. What I have is this: a life that is, quietly and without announcement, mine. An apartment that I pay for with money I earned. A financial situation that is organized and stable and entirely my own decision. A friendship that showed up when I needed it, from a direction I never expected. A 6-year-old boy who knows my name and runs toward me when I walk into a room. And something else, something I've been trying to find the words for. When you spend decades making yourself smaller for the people you love, telling yourself that's what love looks like, that's what a good mother does, a good wife, a good woman in the 3rd row at St. Agatha's, you forget there's a version of you that exists outside of all of that. A version with her own opinions about how to spend her own money, with her own friends, with her own Saturday afternoons made of tea and honest conversation that don't require her to perform anything for anyone. I collapsed on a Tuesday in February, and 31 calls went unanswered, and I lay in a hospital bed long enough to look at the ceiling and understand something I should have understood years ago. I was always going to be okay. I just had to stop waiting for permission from someone who hadn't earned the right to give it. The dinosaur cake was excellent for what it's worth. Finn ate 2 slices and asked if we could do it again next year. I told him we absolutely could. I keep coming back to that grocery list on my kitchen counter. Eggs, milk, the good bread from the bakery on Danforth, sour cream for the pierogies. I'd written it that morning like any other morning, like someone who expected to come home that afternoon and make dinner and go to bed and wake up again the next day without incident. Life doesn't warn you when it's about to change the terms. What I learned, not from a book, not from anyone's advice, but from lying alone in a cardiac unit staring at a textured ceiling, is that the people who show up when it costs them something are the only ones worth counting. Sylvette didn't owe me anything. We'd known each other 4 months. She came back every day anyway, cup of Tim Hortons in hand, asking nothing, offering everything. That's not luck. That's character. And character, I've come to believe, is the only currency that actually holds its value. I spent a long time making excuses for Colin, telling myself he was busy, he didn't realize, he meant well in his own way. And maybe some of that was true. But there's a kind of thinking that lets us avoid the harder question. Not whether someone is busy, but whether we would have been the priority if the situation had been reversed. I knew the answer. I'd known it for years. I just hadn't been willing to sit with it long enough to let it mean something. That's the thing about intelligence that nobody tells you when you're young. It isn't just about being smart in school or making good financial decisions, though those matter too. It's about having the clarity to see your own life accurately, without the fog of wishful thinking. It took me a hospital bed and 4 days of silence to finally see mine clearly. I'm not proud of how long it took, but I'm glad I got there. And then there was the matter of doing something with what I saw. That part was harder. It would have been easier to say nothing, accept the flowers from the hospital gift shop, and go back to being Colin's mother who brought the butter tarts and asked no questions. Easier and smaller. The decision to quietly reorganize my finances, to rewrite my will on my own terms, to stop performing gratitude I didn't feel. None of that was dramatic. Nobody saw it. There was no confrontation, no speech, just a woman at a coffee shop with a notepad and 2 columns, choosing finally to be honest with herself about what she'd built and what she'd been given in return. That quiet kind of courage, the kind that doesn't announce itself, is the hardest kind to sustain. It doesn't get applause. It just gets you a life that's actually yours. I still see Finn. I'll always see Finn. He's 6 years old and he ran across a room full of noise to take my hand, and that matters in a way that nothing his parents did or didn't do can touch. Children are not their parents' choices. I intend to remember that. The dinosaur cake was excellent. I kept the $215,000. And on Tuesday mornings, I sit in a fellowship hall in Scarborough with women who showed up, drinking coffee that's never quite hot enough, and I feel, without apology, like exactly enough. He clicked his glass against the microphone, and the feedback screech cut through the banquet hall like a siren. 200 faces turned toward him. He smiled, the way powerful men smile when they believe no one in the room can touch them. But I had spent 30 years building bridges that could hold the weight of 1,000 truths. His bridge was about to collapse, and every lie he had mortared into its foundation was about to wash downstream for the whole town to see. Welcome to today's story. If you enjoy narratives about family, justice, and standing up when it matters most, please hit that like button, subscribe to join our Gemstone family, and drop a comment telling us where you are watching from. A quick reminder, this tale contains dramatized elements created for storytelling purposes. While names and locations are fictional, the emotions and lessons are real. My name is Catherine Beaulieu. Most people in Kenora, Ontario call me Kat. For 30 years, I worked as a structural engineer for the Ministry of Transportation, inspecting bridges across northwestern Ontario. I know what holds things together and I know what makes them fall apart. I raised my son Ethan by myself from the day he was 5 months old. His father, my husband Daniel, died on the Trans-Canada Highway in November of 1993 when the Whitefish River Bridge gave way beneath his truck during a routine crossing. The investigation called it material fatigue. Act of nature, a tragedy that could not have been predicted. But I had spent my career reading stress reports and load calculations. I knew what material fatigue looked like and I knew what corner cutting looked like. They were not the same thing. The steel in those support cables had been downgraded from specification during construction. Someone had approved thinner gauge wire to save the contractor $400,000. A man named Gerald Foss, the chief engineer at Foss and Whitmore Infrastructure, had signed off on those changes. I found the document 7 months after the funeral, buried in a provincial filing cabinet that a sympathetic clerk let me access after hours. I photographed it with a disposable camera, slid the photo into a sealed envelope, wrote Daniel's name across the front, and I carried that envelope in my work bag every single day for the next 30 years. Daniel had been a carpenter. He built things with his hands, kitchen cabinets and bookshelves, and once, a cradle for Ethan that he carved from a single piece of northern white cedar. On the headboard he had burned 5 words with a wood tool. Made with love, built right. I kept that cradle in Ethan's room long after he outgrew it. When he was old enough to ask, I told him his father made it. When he traced those words with his finger and asked what they meant, I said, "It means your father never cut corners. Not once. Not ever. He believed in doing things the right way, even when no one was watching." Ethan nodded like he understood. He was 6. The early years were a blur of alarm clocks and frozen dinners and highway inspections in -30 weather. I would strap on my hard hat and walk bridge decks in January while the wind off Lake of the Woods tried to knock me sideways. Then, I would drive home, pick Ethan up from my neighbor Margaret's house, help him with his math homework, and fall asleep on the couch with a stack of stress analysis reports on my chest. Margaret never asked for money. She said neighbors take care of each other up here. That is just how it works. Ethan grew up quiet but sharp. He played hockey like every boy in Kenora, but what he really loved was building. By 12, he could frame a wall. By 15, he was helping me read bridge blueprints on weekends, pointing out load discrepancies I had already found, just to see if I would confirm he was right. I always did. He had Daniel's eye for detail and Daniel's stubbornness about doing things properly. He graduated top of his class from Lakehead University in Thunder Bay with a degree in civil engineering. I sat in that auditorium and watched him walk across the stage, and I thought, Daniel, look what we made. He is the best thing either of us ever built. After graduation, Ethan took a job with an Indigenous community infrastructure program in Sioux Lookout, helping design water treatment facilities for First Nations reserves that had been on boil water advisories for years. He called every Sunday evening. He talked about pipe diameters and filtration systems, and the families who cried when clean water came through their taps for the first time. He was his father's son. Then one Sunday in October, his voice changed. It got lighter, higher. The way a voice does when someone is trying to sound casual about something enormous. Mom, I met someone. My chest opened up like spring. Yeah? Her name is Sophie. She is an environmental lawyer. We met at a community consultation in Sioux Lookout. Mom, she is brilliant. She actually understands what I do and she cares about the same things. I leaned back in my kitchen chair, watching the last autumn light come through the window. This was what I had worked for. All those years alone, all those frozen bridge decks. This moment. My son, happy. I cannot wait to meet her. He paused. Her last name is Foss. Sophie Foss. Is that not a beautiful name? Sophie Beaulieu. Or maybe we will hyphenate. The kitchen went silent. Even the furnace stopped blowing. Mom, you there? I am here. My voice came out flat. I have to go, sweetheart. Pot is boiling over. I hung up and sat at the table for an hour. The envelope was in my bag, 3 feet away. Daniel's name in my handwriting, faded but legible. Inside, the photograph of a document that proved Gerald Foss had killed my husband. My son was falling in love with Gerald Foss's daughter. I searched her that night. Sophie Foss, 29, environmental lawyer at a firm in Thunder Bay, Lakehead law graduate, board member of a Northern Clean Water advocacy group. LinkedIn photo showed a woman with kind eyes and a serious mouth. Her father's page was 2 clicks away. Gerald Foss, CEO, Foss and Whitmore Infrastructure, now one of the largest private construction firms in Ontario. Offices in Thunder Bay, Sudbury, and Ottawa. Government contracts worth hundreds of millions. Charity galas, hospital wings with his name on them. The same man who had signed the order to use cheaper steel on the Whitefish River Bridge in 1992. I zoomed in on a company photo. Gerald stood with his arm around Sophie at a ribbon-cutting ceremony for a new highway overpass near Nipigon. Behind them, steel cables gleamed in the sunlight. I wondered if those cables met specification. I wondered if he had changed at all. 3 weeks later, I started looking into Foss and Whitmore's current projects. What I found made my hands shake. The firm had won a provincial contract to build a new bridge over the Wabigon River near Dryden, part of a highway expansion project worth $70 million. I pulled the public filings through a Freedom of Information request. The engineering specs were careful, technical, designed to bore anyone who was not looking for problems. But I had been looking for problems my entire career. The concrete mix ratios were wrong. The rebar spacing was wider than code allowed. The load-bearing calculations assumed traffic volumes from 2005, not the current projections that had doubled since the mining boom. Someone had shaved $12 million off the construction budget by cutting the same corners Gerald Foss had cut 30 years ago. People were going to drive across that bridge every day, logging trucks, school buses, families heading to cottages on summer weekends. And eventually, the math would catch up. It always does. I called a woman named Diane Okafor, an investigative journalist at the Thunder Bay Chronicle. We had met at a public infrastructure forum 2 years earlier. She had written about construction fraud in Northern Ontario, and she was not afraid of powerful men. We met at a Tim Hortons on the highway outside Kenora. I spread the Wabiguan Bridge documents across the table. She studied them in silence for 20 minutes. Then she looked up. This is the same pattern as Whitefish River. Exactly the same. Do you have anyone inside the company? I might, I said. And I did. A man named Paul Redmond had worked at Foss and Whitmore for 20 years. He had contacted me anonymously 3 years earlier after reading about the Whitefish River anniversary in the newspaper. He had said quietly that things had not changed, that Gerald Foss still prioritized margins over safety, that he had documentation. Over 6 weeks, Paul fed us internal emails, budget memos, and inspection reports that had been falsified. Diane cross-referenced everything. The pattern was clear. Foss and Whitmore had systematically downgraded materials on at least 4 major bridge projects across northern Ontario over the past decade. Gerald Foss had personally approved each budget reduction. Then Diane found something that stopped my heart. "Kat, look at this!" Her voice was tight on the phone. "There is a numbered company, 2847391 Ontario Limited, registered to an address in Sioux Lookout. It has received $3.2 million in consulting fees from Foss and Whitmore over the past 18 months. The sole director listed is Ethan Beaulieu." "That is impossible. Ethan has never worked for them." "I know, but his signature is on the incorporation documents. And the company is tied to the Wabigoon Bridge environmental assessment, the one that was rubber-stamped without a proper review." My hands went cold. Gerald Foss was not just cutting corners on another bridge, he was setting up my son to take the blame. An environmental engineer with a numbered company receiving consulting fees for approving an assessment he never conducted. If regulators investigated, if the bridge failed, if people died, Gerald would have a fall guy. And that fall guy was about to become his son-in-law. The same man who killed my husband was now building a trap around my son. I drove to Sioux Lookout on a Thursday. Ethan was not expecting me. I found him at his office, a small converted storefront on the main street, maps of water systems pinned to every wall. He looked surprised and happy. "Mom, what are you doing here? I need to talk to you about something important. About Sophie's father." His face changed, became careful. "If this is about the company, Mom, Gerald has been really supportive. He is helping fund a clean water initiative through the firm. Sophie says he has changed a lot since the early days." "Has he?" "Ethan, have you ever signed documents for a numbered company? Any kind of consulting agreement with Foss and Whitmore?" He stared at me. "What? No. Why would I?" "Think carefully. Any paperwork Sophie might have asked you to sign? Anything Gerald presented at a dinner?" His expression shifted. "There was one thing. Last Christmas, Gerald had a stack of papers at the house, said it was a family investment trust, something about tax planning for when Sophie and I got married. He asked me to sign as a witness. I felt the floor tilt. That was not a witness signature. That was a director registration for a numbered company in your name. Mom, that is insane. Gerald would not do that. The same thing people said about the Whitefish River Bridge. That Gerald Foss would not cut costs on something that could kill people. But he did, and your father died because of it." Silence. Ethan's face went pale. I reached into my bag and pulled out the envelope. 30 years I had carried it. I opened it and placed the photograph on his desk. The cost reduction approval, the downgraded steel specification. Gerald Foss's signature at the bottom. Ethan picked it up. His hands trembled. "You have known this the whole time? Since you were a baby. Why did you never tell me?" "Because I wanted you to grow up building things, not tearing them down. I wanted you to choose engineering because you loved it, not because you wanted revenge." I paused. "But now he is using you, Ethan. He is building a trap with your name on it. And I cannot stay silent anymore." He sat down heavily, stared at the document, then at his phone, where Sophie's photo smiled up from the lock screen. "Does Sophie know?" "I do not think so. But I do not know for certain." That night, Ethan did something that broke and rebuilt my heart at the same time. He drove to Sophie's apartment and told her everything, all of it. The Whitefish River Bridge, Daniel's death, the Wabigoon River documents, the numbered company. She did not believe him at first. Then she pulled out her own laptop and started searching provincial records. By midnight, she had found 3 of the falsified inspection reports herself. She called me at 2 a.m. Her voice was raw. "Mrs. Beaulieu, I am so sorry. I did not know." "I know you did not. I need to tell you something. My father asked me to handle the environmental review for the Wabigoon Bridge project last year. I refused because it was a conflict of interest. He said he would find someone else." She paused. "He found Ethan. Or rather, he found Ethan's name." 2 weeks later, Ethan and Sophie showed up at my kitchen table in Kenora together. Sophie had a folder of documents she had taken from her father's home office. Emails between Gerald and his project managers discussing exactly which specifications to downgrade. Budget projections showing the $12 million in savings. And a separate file labeled contingency, which contained the numbered company documents with Ethan's forged signature, and a memo outlining how the blame would shift to him if regulators investigated. Ethan sat across from me. His jaw was set the way Daniel's used to get when he was angry and trying to stay controlled. Sophie spoke first. I have been his daughter for 29 years. I defended him my entire life. Every time someone questioned his ethics, I said they did not understand the pressures of the industry. She looked at me directly. I was wrong. And I am going to help make this right. I studied this young woman. She had Gerald's forehead, his broad hands, but her eyes were clear and steady in a way his never were. You understand what this means, I said. For your family. For your father. She nodded. My father built his career on lies. I would rather lose his approval than become part of the lie. Ethan reached across the table and took her hand. Sophie squeezed back. I looked at them, and I saw something I had not seen in 30 years. An ally inside the house. 2 of them. The engagement party was Gerald's idea. He insisted on hosting it at the Kenora Harborfront Center, the building his company had renovated 3 years earlier. 200 guests, local politicians, business leaders, contractors, a provincial MPP. Gerald wanted it grand, public, a celebration of his daughter's happiness, and by extension, his own generosity. He did not know that Diane Okafor was on the guest list as Sophie's university friend. He did not know that Paul Redmond had been placed at a table near the back with a clear view of the projection screen. He did not know that the RCMP's Integrated Financial Crime Unit had been briefed 48 hours earlier. I arrived early, found my seat at the family table, front row, because Sophie had insisted. She had called Gerald and told him that her future mother-in-law would sit with the family or there would be no party. He had agreed, irritated but unwilling to make a scene before the event. The room filled. Crystal chandeliers reflected off the harbor through floor-length windows. White tablecloths, orchid centerpieces, a string quartet playing something soft. The kind of evening that costs more than most people in Kenora earn in a year. Gerald took the stage at 8. He wore a charcoal suit and a smile that broadcast control. He tapped the microphone twice. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here tonight to celebrate my daughter Sophie and her fiancé Ethan. He paused, letting the applause settle. I want to talk about what it means to build something. As many of you know, Foss and Whitmore has spent 40 years building the infrastructure of this province. Bridges, highways, overpasses, the physical foundations that connect our communities. He looked at me. The smile tightened. Ethan comes from a modest background. His mother raised him alone after a tragic accident many years ago, and I have to say, she did the best she could with what she had. The room went quiet, not uncomfortable yet, just attentive. But tonight, Ethan joins a family that can offer him more. The resources, the connections, the stability that come from generations of building something that lasts. The irony of those words almost knocked me sideways. Building something that lasts. Daniel's cradle sat in my spare bedroom with those 5 words burned into the headboard. Made with love, built right. Gerald raised his glass. To Sophie and Ethan. To new foundations, to the Foss legacy continuing through the next generation. Scattered applause. Some guests lifted their glasses. Ethan did not. He stood. Every conversation stopped. Thank you, Gerald. He spoke calmly, clearly, the way I had taught him to present findings at engineering reviews. Before we toast, I would like to say something about foundations. Gerald's smile froze. My father was a carpenter named Daniel Beaulieu. He died on November 14th, 1993, when the Whitefish River Bridge collapsed under his truck. I was 5 months old. I never knew him, but my mother kept something of his. She kept a lot of things. He looked at me. I nodded. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small wooden block. I recognized it immediately. It was a cutoff from the cradle, a piece Daniel had sanded smooth and kept in his toolbox. Ethan had found it years ago. On one side, in Daniel's handwriting, the penciled words, "Check twice, trust nothing." "My mother spent 30 years inspecting bridges across this province," Ethan continued. "She knows what holds things together. She also knows what makes them fall apart." Gerald set his glass down. His hand trembled. Sophie stepped forward from the side of the stage. She carried a laptop. Behind her, the projection screen flickered to life. The first image appeared. A provincial filing document from 1992, cost reduction approval, Whitefish River Bridge. Support cable steel downgraded from grade 270 to grade 250. Estimated savings, $400,000. Approved by Gerald Foss, chief engineer. Gerald's face drained. He stepped toward the screen as if he could physically block it. Ethan kept talking. 7 men died on that bridge. My father was one of them. The investigation called it material fatigue. It was not material fatigue. It was a choice to save money at the cost of human lives. The screen changed. A side-by-side comparison of the 1992 Whitefish River specifications and the 2023 Wabigoon River Bridge specifications. Identical patterns of cost reduction, identical downgrades. "And it is happening again," Sophie said. Her voice did not shake. "My father's company is currently building the Wabigoon River Bridge with the same substandard materials, concrete ratios below code, rebar spacing that violates provincial standards. A project designed to fail." Gasps moved through the room like wind through pines. Gerald lunged for the microphone. "This is a lie. This is fabricated." Paul Redmond stood from his table near the back. "It is not fabricated, Gerald. I kept copies of everything. Every email you sent approving the downgrades. Every memo directing us to falsify inspection reports. 20 years of documentation." Gerald pointed at Paul with a shaking finger. "You are fired." "I already resigned," Paul said, 6 weeks ago. The day I handed my files to the RCMP. The room erupted. Chairs scraped. Voices overlapped. The provincial MPP was on his phone. Reporters who had come to cover a happy engagement party were scrambling for their recorders. Sophie turned to her father. She was crying, but her voice held. "You set up Ethan to take the fall. A numbered company in his name. $3.2 million routed through forged signatures. If anyone investigated, he would go to prison for crimes he did not commit." Gerald's composure shattered. His face twisted. "You ungrateful," he started. Ethan stepped between them. "That is enough." The main doors opened. 2 plainclothes RCMP officers entered, followed by a uniformed constable. One of them approached Gerald. "Gerald Foss, you are under arrest for fraud, forgery, and criminal negligence causing death. You have the right to retain and instruct counsel without delay." The room went silent, except for the click of handcuffs. Gerald looked at me as they led him past our table. 30 years of silence, I said quietly. That is how long I carried the truth. I should have spoken sooner, but I am speaking now. His eyes were empty. The smile was gone. They took him out through the kitchen entrance to avoid the growing crowd of reporters at the front. The string quartet had stopped playing. The orchids on the tables looked absurd now, all that careful beauty framing chaos. Sophie collapsed into a chair. Ethan knelt beside her, his arm around her shoulders. I stood behind them. My hand rested on Ethan's back and I felt him breathing, steady, the way Daniel used to breathe when he was concentrating on getting something exactly right. Thank you for staying with this story. If you are still here, drop a 1 in the comments so I know. This narrative contains dramatized elements for storytelling purposes. If this does not resonate with you, feel free to explore other content on our channel. The weeks after the engagement party were not a Hollywood ending. Sophie stopped speaking to most of her family. Her mother called her a traitor. Her brother, who worked at Foss & Whitmore, threatened legal action. Sophie changed her phone number twice and moved into Ethan's apartment in Sioux Lookout, bringing 2 suitcases and a box of law textbooks. Ethan was cleared of all involvement within 3 weeks. The RCMP's forensic accountants confirmed the signatures on the numbered company documents were forged. His name was removed from every filing, but the damage to his reputation took longer to repair. In a small northern community, accusation travels faster than acquittal. He lost 2 contracts. The Clean Water Initiative he had been building for 3 years nearly collapsed when the First Nations Community Council hesitated, worried about association with the Foss scandal. Sophie drove up to the reserve herself and sat with the council for 4 hours, explaining everything, answering every question, offering her legal services pro bono to review all existing contracts. The council voted to continue working with Ethan the next day. I watched this from a distance, not because I was angry with my son. I was not, but because I needed time to reckon with my own silence. 30 years I had carried that envelope. 30 years bridges were being built with substandard materials while I waited for the right moment. How many of those bridges had I inspected myself, knowing what Foss and Whitmore was capable of and never connecting the dots because I told myself it was someone else's job to investigate the contractor? I retired from the ministry 3 months after the arrest, not because anyone asked me to, because I could not sign off on another inspection without questioning whether my silence had made me complicit. Margaret, my neighbor, the woman who had watched Ethan after school for 15 years, sat in my kitchen the day I cleaned out my office. "You are being too hard on yourself, Kat." "Maybe, but not hard enough for 30 years. She set a cup of tea in front of me. "Daniel would not want you to disappear into guilt. He would want you to do something with it." She was right. She was always right. I started the Daniel Boulou Foundation for Infrastructure Safety that winter, a small office above the hardware store on Main Street in Kenora. 1 desk, 1 computer, a filing cabinet full of everything I knew about bridge safety, and everything Paul Redmond had given us about systemic failures in northern construction. Diane Okafor wrote a 6-part investigative series in the Chronicle that ran for 3 weeks. It was picked up nationally. The provincial government announced a full review of all Foss and Whitmore projects. 3 bridges were temporarily closed for emergency inspection. 2 failed. No one had been hurt yet, but the reports showed it was a matter of time. Gerald Foss's trial began the following autumn. Sophie testified for the prosecution. She sat in the witness box in a Thunder Bay courtroom and described how her father had used her fiancé as a scapegoat, how she had spent her career defending his reputation without knowing what lay beneath it. How she had found the contingency file in his office and felt the ground give way beneath her, the same way the Whitefish River Bridge had given way beneath Daniel's truck. Ethan testified too. He brought the wooden block from Daniel's toolbox, held it in his hand while he spoke. "Check twice, trust nothing." He told the court that those words were his father's, that his mother had raised him to inspect everything twice, to never assume something was safe just because someone powerful said it was. That Gerald Foss had exploited his trust and his name and his love for Sophie to build a wall of deniability around decades of criminal negligence. Gerald was convicted on 11 counts. He received 9 years. The night of the verdict, Ethan called me. His voice was steady, but I could hear the weight in it. "Mom, it is over." "No," I said. "It is just starting. The real work starts now." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Sophie is pregnant. 8 weeks. We found out last week. We wanted to tell you in person, but after the trial, everything has been so much." I sat down on my kitchen floor, just sat right down, back against the cupboard Daniel had built, and cried, not sad tears, not happy ones either, something in between that does not have a name. "What are you going to name the baby?" "If it is a boy, she wants to call him Daniel." Something in my chest cracked open so wide I thought it might never close again. The baby arrived in July, 7 pounds, 4 ounces, a full head of dark hair, and his grandfather's hands. I drove to Sioux Lookout the day after he was born. Sophie was sitting up in the hospital bed, looking exhausted and radiant. Ethan was holding the baby with the terrified gentleness of every new father who ever lived. "Mom," he turned toward me, "meet Daniel." I took my grandson in my arms. He weighed almost nothing. His fingers curled around my thumb and held on. "Hi, baby," I whispered. "Your grandfather would have built you the most beautiful cradle in the world." Sophie watched from the bed. "Mrs. Beaulieu, I know what my father took from your family. I know I cannot give it back, but I promise you this baby will grow up knowing who Daniel Beaulieu was, what he stood for, how his wife fought for 30 years to make sure his death meant something." I looked at this woman who had lost her own father to prison and chosen truth over comfort, and I thought, Daniel, she is the real thing. Call me Kat, I said. That autumn, Sophie joined the foundation as our legal advisor. She restructured our advocacy program, filed freedom of information requests that had been stonewalled for years, and built a pro bono legal clinic for families affected by construction negligence. Within a year, she had helped 7 families reopen investigations into workplace deaths that had been dismissed as accidents. Ethan continued his water infrastructure work. The Clean Water Initiative expanded to 12 communities. He drove thousands of kilometers across northern Ontario with blueprint rolls in his back seat and baby Daniel strapped into a car seat beside him. Some weekdays, Sophie would meet him at a reserve and do legal consultations, while Ethan inspected pipe fittings and Daniel napped in a playpen set up in the community hall. I visited every month, then every 2 weeks. Then I stopped counting because at some point the visits stopped being visits and started being life. Margaret came with me once and sat in Sophie's kitchen bouncing Daniel on her knee and said, "Kat, this is what you built. All those years. This right here." On the first anniversary of the conviction, we drove together to the Whitefish River. The old bridge site had been cleared years ago, replaced by a modern span that met every specification. A memorial plaque had been installed on the north bank after Diane's series ran. 7 names etched in granite. Daniel Bolia, 3rd from the top. Little Daniel was 14 months old, toddling on unsteady legs. Sophie held his hand while Ethan carried flowers. I knelt at the plaque and touched Daniel's name. The granite was cold under my fingers, the way everything is cold in northern Ontario in November. "I brought them," I said quietly to the stone. "Your son, his wife, your grandson. They are good people, Daniel. The best." Ethan crouched beside me. He placed the wooden block against the base of the memorial. "Check twice. Trust nothing." "He built things right," Ethan said to his son, who was trying to pick up a pine cone. "Your grandpa, Daniel. He never cut a single corner." Little Daniel held up the pine cone triumphantly. "Mama, look." Sophie laughed through her tears. "I see it, baby." We stood there, 3 generations and the ghost of a 4th, while Lake of the Woods shimmered gray and endless behind us. The new bridge hummed with traffic, safe traffic. Trucks and cars and school buses crossing without fear because someone, somewhere, had done the math correctly, had used the right steel, had checked twice. I pulled the envelope from my bag. 30 years I had carried it. Daniel's name in my handwriting faded almost to nothing. Inside, the photograph that had started everything. I held it out to Ethan. "This belongs to the foundation now. Not in my bag, not hidden. On the wall where everyone can see it." He took it carefully, the way you hold something that is both evidence and relic, both weapon and wound. Sophie put her arm through mine. We walked back to the car together while little Daniel waved goodbye to the plaque like it was a person he knew. They call it revenge. I call it accountability. Not the kind that comes from anger, though there was plenty of that. The kind that comes from refusing to let powerful men bury their mistakes in the same ground where they buried our families. 30 years of silence cost me things I cannot calculate. Years I could have spent fighting instead of waiting. Bridges that might have been caught sooner, lives that might have been saved. I will carry that weight alongside the grief for the rest of my days. But I also built something in those 30 years. A son who knows that integrity is not negotiable. A daughter-in-law who chose truth over her own bloodline. A grandson who will grow up hearing his grandfather's name spoken with pride, not grief. Do not be like me. Do not wait 30 years. When you see wrong, speak. When you see corners being cut, sound the alarm. When powerful people tell you to move on, to accept the official story, to stop asking questions, plant your feet and ask louder. God gave us voices not so we could stay comfortable, but so we could stand for those who can no longer stand for themselves. 7 men died on a bridge that should have held. Their silence is permanent. Ours does not have to be. Made with love, built right, that is what Daniel carved into our son's cradle. That is what I want carved into everything we leave behind. Not just the bridges and the buildings, but the families, the communities, the quiet, ordinary days where we choose to do the hard thing instead of the easy thing. Build right, check twice, and never ever trust a man who tells you the foundation is fine when you can see the cracks yourself. Thank you for staying through this entire journey. Drop a 2 in the comments so I know you made it to the end. This narrative includes dramatized elements designed for storytelling and reflection. If this style resonates with you, subscribe and join our Gemstone family. Share your story below. Your voice might be the one that gives someone else the courage to speak.